The morning sun cast long shadows across James Harwood's weathered farm as he moved with quiet purpose through his daily routine. At 58, Jimmy, as the locals called him, had the appearance of a man who'd spent his entire life working the land. His hands were calloused, his skin tanned and creased from decades under the Texas sun, and his gait was the unhurried pace of someone who understood that farming followed nature's timeline, not man's. The 100-acre property sat just 30 miles north of the Rio Grande, a modest spread by Texas standards, but sufficient for Jimmy's needs. Fields of grain stretched toward the eastern horizon, while his small herd of cattle grazed on the western pastures. The white farmhouse, though in need of a fresh coat of paint, stood sturdy against the elements, much like its owner. Jimmy raised a tin cup of black coffee to his lips as he surveyed his land from the porch steps. There was something in his gaze, a vigilance that seemed excessive for a man whose greatest daily concern should have been the weather or the price of feed. His eyes systematically scanned the perimeter of his property, pausing briefly at certain points as if checking invisible markers. "Another day above ground," he murmured to himself, a phrase that carried more weight than casual listeners might recognize. The township of Esperanza was small enough that most residents knew each other by name. At the general store, Jimmy was greeted with familiar nods as he collected his weekly supplies. "Morning, Jimmy," called Martha from behind the counter. "Heard you helped old Bill Jackson fix that tractor of his yesterday." Jimmy shrugged modestly. "Wasn't much. Just a loose connection. Still mighty nice of you. That's what keeps this community going. Folks helping folks." Martha smiled as she rang up his purchases. "You coming to the town council meeting tonight? They're talking about increasing sheriff patrols along the county line." "Might do," Jimmy replied noncommittally, though his interest was evident in the slight narrowing of his eyes. His reputation in Esperanza was that of a helpful but reserved neighbor. He'd shown up 12 years ago, purchased the old Donaldson place with cash, and set about restoring it to working order with a quiet efficiency that impressed the local farmers. He rarely spoke about his past, deflecting personal questions with a polite change of subject that was too smooth to seem rude but effective nonetheless. What the people of Esperanza didn't know, what no one except a select few in the U.S. government knew, was that James Harwood had spent 27 years in the darkest corners of American Special Operations. His real name, buried under classified documents, hadn't been spoken aloud in over a decade. At home, Jimmy moved toward his barn, a structure he'd reinforced beyond what would seem necessary for storing farm equipment. Inside, he completed chores with methodical precision, feeding livestock and checking equipment with the same attention to detail he'd once devoted to mission preparations. Lunch was exactly at noon, not from hunger, but from the discipline of a man who had spent decades keeping precise schedules. As he ate a simple sandwich, his gaze drifted to the window, watching a dust cloud approach along the rural road. His body tensed imperceptibly, and he silently counted the seconds until a border patrol vehicle came into view. The tension left his shoulders, but only partially. When the vehicle pulled into his drive, Jimmy was already at the door. "Dad," greeted Michael Harwood, stepping out in his green uniform. At 32, he had his father's build and observant eyes, though none of the deeper shadows that lurked behind them. "Didn't know you were coming by today," Jimmy said, though something in his manner suggested he'd been anticipating this visit. "Just finished patrol. Thought I'd check in." Michael followed his father inside. "You've been keeping up with the news?" Jimmy nodded once. "Cartel activity increasing across the county. 3 farms hit last month." Michael raised an eyebrow. "You certainly stay informed for someone who claims to avoid town gossip." A slight smile crossed Jimmy's face. "Hard not to hear things." What went unsaid was how Jimmy supplemented local news with his own observations, the subtle changes in traffic patterns on the border roads, the unfamiliar vehicles that occasionally appeared on the ridge line 2 miles south, the increasing frequency of helicopter patrols. "They're getting bolder," Michael continued, "setting up distribution points deeper into Texas territory. Sheriff's Department is overwhelmed, and we're stretched thin covering the actual border. He studied his father with a mixture of concern and curiosity. "You ever think about getting some help around here?" "Place the size, man your age." "I manage fine," Jimmy replied, the statement holding a double meaning neither acknowledged aloud. After Michael left, Jimmy walked to the rear of his barn, checking that he was alone before kneeling beside what appeared to be an ordinary section of flooring. His fingers found the hidden latch, revealing a compartment beneath. Inside lay items incongruous with their surroundings: a maintained but aging satellite phone, a weatherproof case containing documents, and a small wooden box. Jimmy opened the box with reverent care. Inside, military medals gleamed against dark velvet, badges of honor from conflicts the public had never been told about. His fingers hovered over them, not quite touching, as memories cascaded through his mind. Bogota, 1989. The jungle canopy above, the sound of water against the hull of a small boat. 6 men moving silently through territory controlled by forces that would execute them on sight. Kandahar, 2002. The bitter cold of a mountain night. The weight of responsibility for his team as they tracked high-value targets through territory no conventional forces could penetrate. Undisclosed location, Eastern Europe, 2007. His final mission. The operation that had gone perfectly until the extraction. 3 good men lost. His decision to disappear into civilian life afterward, unable to continue after those losses. Jimmy closed the box with a decisive click, returning it to its hiding place. The medals weren't for vanity. He'd never been that type of soldier. They were reminders of the cost of the skills he possessed, skills he hoped never to need again. The afternoon sun found him mending fences along his eastern property line, a task that also allowed him to survey neighboring lands. His weathered hands worked with mechanical efficiency, while his eyes cataloged details most would miss. The distant glint of light off glass where no building stood. Tire tracks on a rarely used access road. Small changes, but to Jimmy, they formed a pattern. Someone was watching the area, watching with purpose. During his special operations career, Jimmy had specialized in counterinsurgency. He had an intimate understanding of how organizations infiltrated new territory, the surveillance phase, the mapping of resources and threats, the slow establishment of presence. What he was seeing now followed those patterns with uncomfortable precision. At sunset, Jimmy completed his daily routine with a careful inspection of his property boundaries. To casual observers, it might have appeared that he was simply checking for damaged fencing or wandering livestock. In reality, he was checking nearly invisible markers he'd established, fishing line positioned at specific heights, patterns in the gravel at access points, branches arranged in formations that would be disturbed by passage. Back at the house, he sat on his porch with a glass of whiskey, watching darkness claim the land. The stillness of rural Texas had been his salvation after years of living with adrenaline and danger. He'd chosen this place carefully, remote enough for privacy, but connected enough to remain aware of broader happenings. His son had been 16 when Jimmy retired and became a farmer. Michael had known his father was military, but never learned the full extent of his classified operations. Their relationship had been distant during Jimmy's active years, with long deployments and the constant shield of secrecy creating barriers. Farming had been Jimmy's attempt to rebuild that connection, to become the father he'd never had the chance to be. The irony wasn't lost on him that Michael had chosen Border Patrol, drawn to service in his own way. The parallels worried Jimmy sometimes, the dangerous territory, the unpredictable adversaries. But he respected his son's choice, even as he noted the increasing risks as cartel influence pushed northward. Inside, Jimmy prepared for bed with the same efficiency that characterized all his movements. The farmhouse appeared ordinary, but subtle security measures were incorporated throughout. Reinforced door frames, strategic furniture placement that eliminated blind spots, escape routes from every room. Jimmy hadn't survived covert operations across 4 continents by leaving things to chance. Even in retirement, those habits remained. though they had softened over the years as peace gradually replaced vigilance. As he lay in bed, his mind cataloged the day's observations, fitting them into the larger pattern he'd been tracking for months. Cartel expansion was nothing new along the border, but this felt different, more organized, more strategic. Sleep came to Jimmy as it always did, immediately when needed, but lightly enough that the slightest disturbance would wake him fully alert. Another carryover from his former life. His dreams, when they came, were a mixture of pastoral scenes and combat memories. Harvesting wheat while scanning for snipers. Checking cattle while mentally mapping exfiltration routes. His subconscious never fully released the training that had kept him alive through decades of service. Dawn arrived with Jimmy already awake, moving through his morning routine with practiced ease. Coffee brewed, perimeter checked, plans for the day organized with military precision. As he walked to his barn to begin the day's work, he noticed fresh tire tracks on the dirt road that passed his property, tracks made during the night by a vehicle moving slowly, without headlights. Something most people would never notice, but to Jimmy, it might as well have been a flashing warning sign. Someone had been observing his farm in darkness. Jimmy continued to his barn unhurriedly, giving no outward sign that he'd noticed anything amiss. Inside, he went about his morning chores while mentally calculating what this development might mean. After 12 years of peace, the tactical assessment came to him with disturbing ease, as though he'd never left that world behind. In town later that morning, Jimmy paid closer attention to unfamiliar faces. Esperanza was small enough that newcomers stood out, and he noted two men at the diner who didn't fit the profile of local ranchers or oil workers. Their casual posture couldn't hide the alertness in their eyes, the way they tracked movement, the subtle bulge of concealed weapons under light jackets despite the Texas heat. Jimmy bought his feed and supplies as usual, exchanging pleasantries with locals while keeping the strangers in his peripheral vision. They showed no interest in him, the unremarkable older farmer in worn jeans and a faded work shirt. His practiced ordinariness had become an effective camouflage over the years. Back at his farm, Jimmy made a decision. That evening, after completing his chores, he retrieved the satellite phone from its hiding place and powered it up for the first time in years. He dialed a number from memory, one that would reach a very specific desk in a nondescript government building. Authentication Delta 7 November Echo 3, he stated when the line connected. A pause. Authentication expired. Identify. Whiskey Actual, Code Sunset, requesting wildfire update. Another pause, longer this time. Stand by for callback. Jimmy ended the call, knowing the system would now work to verify his identity through multiple channels. He was breaking over a decade of silence, but the patterns he was seeing warranted information beyond what was available through public channels. 15 minutes later, the phone rang. James, came a voice he recognized despite the years. Didn't expect to hear this line again. Thompson, you're still at the desk. Some of us didn't get the luxury of retirement, Thompson replied, though without resentment. What's triggered this call? Jimmy described what he'd observed, the surveillance patterns, the unfamiliar operatives in town, the nighttime activity, using the precise, economical language of his former profession. You're not imagining things, Thompson confirmed after listening. Gulf Cartel is establishing a major corridor through your county. Intelligence suggests they're clearing the path for something bigger than the usual drug routes. Define bigger. Human trafficking. Weapons. We've intercepted communications about moving high-value packages. They're investing significant resources. Jimmy absorbed this information silently. You should consider relocation, Thompson added. Your location is compromised. Meaning? A hesitation on the line. 3 former operators with profiles similar to yours have been targeted in the past 6 months. Arizona, New Mexico, West Texas. Professional hits disguised as home invasions. The implication was clear. Someone was hunting retired special operators along the border. I appreciate the intelligence, Jimmy said finally. James, Thompson's voice took on an unofficial tone. The agency can arrange extraction. 24 hours. Jimmy looked around at the farm he'd built, the life he'd created. Noted, "But this is my home." After ending the call, Jimmy returned the phone to its hiding place and walked out to his porch. The stars were brilliant in the clear Texas sky, a view he'd come to treasure after years of operating in urban centers and dense jungles. He considered Thompson's warning dispassionately. Relocation would be the logical choice from a security perspective. But logic wasn't everything. This land, this community, had given him something he'd never found in his former life: a sense of belonging, of creating rather than destroying. The decision formed itself with the clarity that had characterized his most successful operations. He would stay, but he would prepare. Tomorrow, he would begin restoring the skills and mindset he'd deliberately set aside 12 years ago. The cartel was establishing territory, hunting men like him, threatening the peace he'd found. They had no idea what they were awakening. The first direct sign came 3 days later. Jimmy was returning from the eastern field when he noticed the barn door ajar, not wide open, but not fully closed as he'd left it. Most people would have attributed it to the wind or their own forgetfulness. Jimmy knew better. His habits were too ingrained, his awareness of his surroundings too acute for such an oversight. He approached unhurriedly, maintaining the appearance of an ordinary farmer with nothing to fear. Inside, everything appeared undisturbed at first glance. The tractor sat where he'd left it. Tools hung in their designated places. Feed bags were stacked against the wall. But Jimmy's trained eye caught the subtle inconsistencies: dust patterns disrupted on the workbench, a rake angled differently than he'd left it, boot prints not his own partially visible in the corner. Someone had searched his barn with professional care. Jimmy continued his inspection methodically, his mind cataloging each anomaly while his outward demeanor remained casual. When he reached the back section, his pulse quickened slightly. The hidden compartment beneath the floorboards appeared untouched, but the wooden plank that concealed it had been repositioned with imperfect precision. Someone had discovered his cache. Inside the compartment, the satellite phone and documents appeared undisturbed. The wooden box containing his medals, however, had been opened. The medals themselves remained, but Jimmy could tell they'd been examined and replaced, not quite aligned as he'd left them. "So that's how it is," he murmured to himself, understanding the significance. His military background was now known to whoever had searched his property. That evening, Jimmy sat on his porch with a shotgun visible across his lap. Not his preferred weapon, but the expected choice for a Texas farmer concerned about coyotes or intruders. The actual arsenal he'd begun assembling was concealed throughout his property, each piece cleaned and prepared with the methodical care of someone who understood that equipment failure could mean death. The sheriff's cruiser that pulled into his driveway just after sunset was expected. Howard Beck had been sheriff of the county for 15 years, a decent man with military experience of his own, though conventional forces rather than special operations. "Evening, Jimmy," Sheriff Beck called as he approached. "Mind if I join you?" Jimmy gestured to the empty chair beside him. "Coffee's fresh inside if you want some." "I'm good, thanks." Beck settled into the chair with a sigh that spoke of long hours and inadequate rest. "Thought you should know we had reports of suspicious vehicles along your section of road yesterday. Routine patrol, or checking if you've seen anything unusual?" It was phrased as a casual inquiry, but Jimmy detected the underlying purpose. Beck was warning him, as directly as his position allowed. "Can't say I have," Jimmy replied, "but I appreciate the heads up." Beck nodded, studying the darkening landscape. "Times are changing around here, Jimmy. These cartels, they're not like the smugglers and runners we used to deal with. They're organized, well-funded, military-grade operations now. So I've heard. 3 ranches hit in the neighboring county last month. Made to look like robberies gone bad, but it was too professional, too clean." Beck turned to face him directly. "They're establishing territory, clearing what they consider obstacles." Jimmy met his gaze evenly. "And you're telling me this because?" "Because they seem to have specific targets. People who might recognize their tactics. People who might resist effectively." Beck paused meaningfully. Former military, particularly those with certain specialized backgrounds. The implication hung in the air between them. Beck knew, or at least suspected, something about Jimmy's past. "I'm just a farmer, Howard," Jimmy said quietly. "Sure you are." Beck stood, adjusting his belt. "And I'm just giving a routine warning to all the isolated properties in my jurisdiction." He stepped off the porch, then turned back. "Jimmy, whatever you were before, these people have resources. Intelligence. They identify threats systematically." Jimmy nodded once, acknowledging the warning without confirming anything. "I've got limited manpower," Beck continued. "Response times out here are 20 minutes best case. Just so you know where things stand." "Appreciated." After the sheriff departed, Jimmy surveyed his property with new intensity. The game had changed. His background had been compromised, which meant he was now categorized as a threat to whoever was moving into the territory. The cartel would have his military record, would understand the capabilities he represented, would know he couldn't be intimidated or easily neutralized like an ordinary civilian. They would come prepared for what he had been, not understanding that what he had become, a disciplined operator with the patience and territorial knowledge of a farmer, was potentially more dangerous. Dawn found Jimmy on the roof of his barn with high-powered binoculars, conducting a methodical survey of the surrounding terrain. To the casual observer, he might have been checking for predators threatening his livestock. In reality, he was establishing observation points, identifying potential approaches and vulnerabilities, mentally mapping fields of fire. From his elevated position, Jimmy spotted what he was looking for, the glint of morning sunlight reflecting off glass on a ridge 2 miles south. Someone was observing his property through a spotting scope or similar equipment. Military or law enforcement would have been more careful about reflection. This was cartel surveillance, professional but not top-tier. Throughout the day, Jimmy maintained his normal routine while executing a careful plan to establish countermeasures. He repaired fence lines, positioning trail cameras disguised as ordinary equipment. He checked irrigation systems, burying motion sensors at key access points. He inspected his cattle, using the opportunity to survey the terrain from different angles. By mid-afternoon, he confirmed 3 separate observation points monitoring his property. The cartel was committing significant resources to surveillance, which confirmed his status as a priority target. The question was whether they intended intimidation, abduction, or elimination. In town for supplies, Jimmy noted the same 2 men from earlier in the week, now joined by a third. Their attempt to appear as ordinary travelers was undermined by subtle behavioral markers, the way they maintained sight lines to exits, their positioning that provided mutual coverage, the unnatural casualness of their interactions. At the hardware store, Jimmy purchased items that would raise no suspicions: wire for fencing, tools, ordinary farm supplies. Mrs. Guthrie, who'd run the store for 30 years, chatted as she rang up his purchases. "Those fellows been asking about you," she said quietly, nodding toward the window where one of the strangers could be seen across the street. Jimmy raised an eyebrow. "That's so. MHMM. Asking how long you'd been here, if you lived alone, if you had family nearby." She fixed him with a meaningful look. "I told them what I tell anyone asking too many questions, that Jimmy Harwood keeps to himself, and that's just fine with us." "I appreciate that, Mrs. Guthrie. My Harold served in Vietnam," she added, referring to her late husband. "He could always spot another veteran. Said you carried yourself like someone who'd seen serious action. Whatever's going on, you be careful, Jimmy." The small-town grapevine had its advantages. The people of Esperanza might not know the details of his past, but their protective attitude toward one of their own would complicate cartel intelligence gathering. Returning to his farm, Jimmy spotted an unfamiliar black SUV parked half a mile down his access road, partially concealed among trees. Bold move. Direct intimidation rather than continued covert surveillance. They were accelerating their timeline. Instead of confronting them, Jimmy took an alternate route to his property, using an overgrown service road that connected to his back acreage. The tactical advantage would remain his as long as he controlled when and where contact occurred. That evening, he called his son. "Dad," Michael answered, surprised. Jimmy rarely initiated calls. "Everything okay?" "Just checking in," Jimmy replied, keeping his tone casual despite the encryption device he'd attached to his phone. "How's work been?" Michael hesitated, clearly sensing something beneath the ordinary question. "Busy. Intercepted a major shipment yesterday. Intelligence suggests there's unusual movement across the sector." "That's so? Anything near Esperanza?" "Nothing confirmed, but there's chatter. We're stretched thin covering the main crossing points." Another pause. "Dad, is something going on?" "You never call about work." "Just interested. Heard some talk in town." The conversation continued with similar careful exchanges, neither man directly stating what both understood, that danger was approaching and Jimmy was potentially in its path. After ending the call, Jimmy completed final preparations. Weapons were positioned at strategic points throughout his property. Escape routes were cleared and supplied. Communication protocols were established with the few people he trusted. As midnight approached, Jimmy detected movement along his western perimeter. Two figures, moving with the deliberate care of those trained in covert approach. He tracked them through night vision equipment, watching as they systematically photographed his property and tested security measures. He could have eliminated them easily from his position. The rifle beside him was capable of precision shots at far greater distances, and his skills remained sharp despite the years. But direct confrontation wasn't the objective yet. Intelligence gathering went both ways, and these intruders were providing valuable information about cartel tactics and personnel. The following morning, Jimmy drove into town for his regular coffee at the local diner. The routine was part of his cover, but also an opportunity to gather information. As expected, the three strangers were there, now making less effort to conceal their observation of him. "Morning," Jimmy called Elaine, the waitress who'd served him coffee for the past decade. "The usual?" "Please." As she poured his coffee, she leaned closer. "Those men been asking about you all morning. Offering money for information." Jimmy nodded slightly. "Thanks for the heads up. Sheriff came by earlier. Said to tell you he's increased patrols on the county road." The community was rallying in its way. Small towns had their own intelligence networks, and Esperanza was closing ranks around one of its own. It wouldn't stop what was coming, but it complicated the cartel's operations, forced them to be more visible than they'd prefer. Jimmy sipped his coffee, casually making eye contact with the lead observer, a calculated move to communicate awareness without hostility. The man held his gaze briefly before looking away, touching his ear in a gesture that suggested communication with others. Back at the farm, Jimmy found what he'd been expecting. During his absence, another search of his property had been conducted, less careful than the first. Cabinet doors left slightly ajar, items moved on shelves, boot prints visible in the soft earth behind his house. They'd been looking for something specific this time. The question was what? The answer came that evening when his satellite phone rang, a device known only to a very limited circle within the government. "Harwood," he answered. "They've accessed your file." It was Thompson, his former handler. Someone breached a specific database containing information about Operation Sandstorm. Jimmy felt a cold certainty settle over him. Sandstorm had been one of his final operations, a classified mission targeting cartel leadership with connections to terrorist financing. The official record showed it as a limited success, with secondary targets eliminated but primary objectives missed. The unofficial reality had been more complex. Primary targets had indeed been eliminated, but through means that never entered any official record. Methods that, if exposed, would create significant political complications. How complete was the breach? Jimmy asked. Limited. They have the official version, not the full picture, but enough to identify operators involved. And their interest? The son of one of the targets is now a principal leader in the Gulf Cartel. Name's Alejandro Vega. Intel suggests this is personal for him. Jimmy absorbed this information silently. Revenge was a more dangerous motivation than territorial expansion. It made operations less predictable, outcomes less manageable. You need extraction, Thompson continued. This isn't standard cartel business. Vega has dedicated significant resources to identifying everyone connected to Sandstorm. Noted. Damn it, James. 3 of your former team are already dead. This isn't about your farm or your retirement. It's about finishing what they believe you started. After ending the call, Jimmy considered his options with the detached clarity that had defined his operational career. Extraction meant safety, but abandonment of the life he'd built. Remaining meant confrontation, with uncertain odds and collateral risks to the community. The decision solidified as he looked out across his land in the fading light. This place represented something he'd fought for throughout his career: the quiet safety of American communities, the right of people to live without fear. Leaving would mean conceding that territory, both physically and symbolically. He would stand his ground, but on his terms. The cartel expected to hunt him. He would ensure they found themselves the hunted instead. The following day brought the first direct approach. A black SUV pulled into his driveway around noon. 2 men emerged. One of the observers from town and a new face, older, more polished, clearly in charge. Jimmy watched their approach from his porch, shotgun visible but not directly threatening. His posture relaxed while his mind calculated distances, angles, response options. Mr. Harwood. The older man called in accented English. I hope we're not interrupting your day. Private property, Jimmy responded evenly. Unless you're lost or selling something, I'd say you are interrupting. The man smiled without warmth. My name is Ramirez. I represent business interests looking to expand in this region. Your property occupies a strategic location for our transportation needs. Not for sale. Perhaps we could discuss a generous offer. The current market value would be significantly exceeded. Jimmy maintained eye contact, his expression neutral. As I said, not for sale. At any price. Ramirez's smile tightened. Mr. Harwood, or should I say, Captain Harwood? I admire your dedication to this modest establishment. But circumstances are changing in this region. It would be unfortunate if your operation encountered difficulties. Equipment malfunctions, livestock health issues, access road problems. The threat was clear, delivered with the practiced smoothness of someone accustomed to intimidation. I appreciate your concern, Jimmy replied, his tone unchanged. But I've dealt with difficult circumstances before. This land isn't just property to me. Everyone has a price, Captain, or a pressure point. Ramirez glanced toward a photograph visible through the window. Jimmy's son in his Border Patrol uniform. Family, for instance. I understand your son works in a dangerous profession. Something shifted in Jimmy's eyes, a momentary glimpse of the man he had been, the operator who had executed missions that remained classified decades later. It vanished quickly, but not before Ramirez recognized it and took an involuntary step back. I think we're done here, Jimmy said quietly. I'd suggest you leave now. Ramirez recovered his composure, nodding slightly. We'll be in touch, Captain. I hope you'll reconsider our generous approach before alternatives become necessary. As the SUV departed, Jimmy knew the preliminary phase had ended. Direct threats against his son had accelerated the timeline. The cartel had shifted from intelligence gathering to overt intimidation, which meant operational engagement would follow soon. Inside, Jimmy activated a series of protocols he'd established days earlier. Alerts to specific contacts within law enforcement, encrypted messages to former colleagues who monitored certain channels, and a specific warning to his son about increased threat levels. The groundwork was laid. The enemy had declared their intentions. Now the true confrontation would begin, not as they expected, with a desperate farmer overwhelmed by cartel force, but as Jimmy intended, with prepared defenses and the lethal efficiency of a man who had spent decades mastering asymmetric warfare. That night, as Ramirez reported to Alejandro Vega via secure communication, he noted the strange calmness in Harwood's demeanor, the lack of fear despite direct threats. Something about the encounter had disturbed Ramirez, a recognition that they might have miscalculated. that the man they were threatening was not simply an aging veteran but something more dangerous. Vega dismissed these concerns. The plan would proceed. Harwood would be taken, forced to provide information about the other surviving members of Operation Sandstorm, and then made an example. His property would become another cartel waypoint in their expanding territory. Neither man understood that while they planned their assault, Jimmy Harwood was completing preparations that would transform his peaceful farm into a killing field for anyone who threatened what he had built, what he protected. The quiet farmer was disappearing, replaced by the operator he had once been, a transformation as methodical and precise as everything else in his carefully constructed life. They came at 3 in the morning, the traditional hour of vulnerability when human alertness reaches its lowest ebb. 6 vehicles, approaching with headlights off, using the rural access roads that bordered Jimmy's property. 20 men minimum, based on the transport capacity. Professional equipment, judging by the absence of engine noise and the disciplined radio silence. But Jimmy Harwood wasn't asleep. He hadn't truly slept since the direct threat against his son 2 days earlier. Instead, he'd entered the state familiar to operators in hostile territory, cycles of tactical rest, maintaining awareness while conserving energy. His body rested while his mind remained connected to the network of sensors and triggers he'd established throughout his property. The first silent alarm activated when the lead vehicle crossed the cattle guard at his southern boundary. Jimmy was instantly alert, checking the tablet that displayed feeds from strategically placed cameras. The cartel force was approaching systematically, using a formation that suggested formal tactical training. 2-man teams establishing a perimeter, main force following in standard assault configuration. Their operational security was compromised by arrogance. They expected a single man, even one with military background, to be quickly overwhelmed by superior numbers. They hadn't accounted for the preparation time Jimmy had utilized, or the specific skills his classified career had developed. Jimmy moved silently through his darkened house, activating pre-established countermeasures. Remote lights positioned to temporarily blind night vision equipment. Controlled electrical failures to disable security monitoring. Prepared routes that would channel approaching forces into predetermined engagement zones. As he worked, his mind flashed to Bogota, 1989. A similar situation, outnumbered, surrounded, with limited support options. His team had been tasked with extracting an intelligence asset from a compound guarded by forces with superior numbers and local knowledge. The operation had succeeded because of preparation, because of understanding the terrain better than the enemy, because of converting apparent disadvantages into tactical leverage. The same principles applied now. The cartel viewed his isolated farm as a vulnerability. Jimmy had transformed it into a fortress with defensive features invisible to even trained observers. Through his monitoring system, he watched the assault team approach his barn first, the logical target based on their previous searches. They would have identified it as containing his weapons cache, his communications equipment, his tactical supplies. What they couldn't know was that those materials had been relocated, the barn converted into the first of several prepared engagement zones. Jimmy settled into his primary observation position, a reinforced space within his house that provided visual coverage of the approach vectors. His breathing slowed as he entered the operational mindset that had defined his professional life, detached, analytical, processing tactical information without emotional interference. The first team breached the barn door with practiced efficiency. No wasted movement, standard 2-man entry technique. They were good, better than typical cartel soldiers. Likely former military or police, either corrupted or coerced into cartel service. 6 men total entered the structure, followed by a command element that remained near the entrance. Jimmy activated the first countermeasure remotely. Inside the barn, specially positioned speakers suddenly emitted the distinctive sound of a shotgun being racked, amplified and projected from multiple directions simultaneously. It was a psychological operation technique he'd learned during counterinsurgency training, disorienting adversaries by creating auditory confusion. The effect was immediate. The assault team scattered for cover, their disciplined formation momentarily broken by the unexpected stimulus. In that moment of tactical disruption, Jimmy triggered the secondary measure. Pre-positioned flashbang devices detonated in precisely calculated locations, designed not to cause permanent damage but to create maximum disorientation. Through his thermal imaging, Jimmy watched the team's coordinated assault dissolve into individual survival responses. 2 men blinded, 3 disoriented, 1 maintaining partial effectiveness but separated from supporting elements. The command figure at the entrance was already communicating urgently on his radio, likely calling for the secondary team to adjust their approach. Jimmy had anticipated this response. As the second team diverted from the house toward the barn, they crossed the invisible boundary of his next prepared zone. Pressure plates triggered the irrigation systems, suddenly flooding specific sections of ground with water. Under normal circumstances, this would be merely inconvenient. In the near-freezing temperatures of the early morning, with specialized equipment sensitive to moisture, it created significant operational complications. The cartel forces paused, reassessing their approach. Jimmy used this moment to change position, moving silently through a concealed route to his secondary observation post. The momentary advantage was tactical, not decisive. They still had overwhelming numerical superiority and would soon adapt their approach. The objective wasn't to defeat them through these initial countermeasures, but to disrupt their operational tempo, to seize psychological initiative. His earpiece crackled with intercepted communications. The cartel teams were switching to their backup frequency, unaware that Jimmy had identified their communication protocols days earlier. Primary approach compromised. Switch to contingency alpha. Possible booby traps, proceed with full tactical sweep. Target is confirmed hostile, likely armed. Authorization for maximum force granted. The voice speaking was controlled but tense, the command structure already showing stress fractures. Jimmy allowed himself a brief moment of cold satisfaction. Psychological dominance in asymmetric warfare often determined outcomes more than raw firepower. The attack resumed with modified tactics. The team had regrouped, now advancing with the caution of forces expecting resistance. They'd abandoned stealth in favor of speed and firepower, using suppressive fire to cover their movement toward the house. Standard response to an ambush, overwhelming force to regain initiative. Jimmy triggered his third countermeasure sequence. Carefully positioned propane tanks near the perimeter detonated in controlled sequences, creating a pattern of explosions that suggested a more extensive defensive preparation than actually existed. Simultaneously, automated lighting systems activated across the property, eliminating the darkness that had concealed approaching forces. The effect was dramatic. Assault teams suddenly exposed in open ground, their black tactical gear now obvious against the illuminated farmyard. Their advance halted as they sought whatever cover was available, the coordinated movement fragmenting into individual survival responses. Over his intercepted communications, Jimmy heard increasingly urgent commands. Fall back to covered positions. Sniper threat potential high. Alpha team provides suppressive fire. Bravo team establish. Jimmy didn't allow them time to reorganize. From his covered position, he began selective fire with a suppressed rifle. He wasn't aiming to kill but to disable. Precise shots that struck communication equipment, weapon-mounted lights, exposed gear. Each shot calculated to increase confusion without immediately confirming his exact position. The cartel forces returned fire, directing thousands of rounds toward positions where Jimmy had never been. Their fire discipline deteriorated as minutes passed without effective contact, ammunition being expended against phantom threats, while Jimmy continued his systematic disruption of their equipment and coordination. In his earpiece, the commands became increasingly frustrated. Negative contact, target location unknown. Surveillance indicates single operator, but tactical response suggests possible additional forces. Sweep for negative. Intelligence confirmed isolation. Target has military background, possible special operations. Adjust tactical approach accordingly. Jimmy's mind flashed to another operation, Kandahar 2002. His team outnumbered, surrounded by tribal forces with superior local knowledge. They'd survived by creating the impression of a larger force, by disrupting enemy communication, by transforming disadvantages into advantages. The same principles applied now. The cartel expected to hunt an aging farmer. Instead, they'd encountered a defensive operation executed with professional precision. The psychological impact was evident in their deteriorating tactical cohesion. After 20 minutes of ineffective engagement, the cartel force began a partial withdrawal. Not a full retreat, but a tactical repositioning. 7 operators maintaining suppressive fire while the main force fell back to their vehicles, likely to reconsider their approach. Jimmy used this opportunity to implement the next phase of his defense. As the vehicles began to move, they encountered the caltrops he distributed across likely extraction routes, simple but effective devices that punctured tires and disabled 3 vehicles immediately. The remaining vehicles were forced to abandon their standard evacuation formation, creating additional confusion. Through his surveillance, Jimmy noted an SUV separate from the main force, heading toward the county road with greater urgency than the others. Inside would be the operation commander, likely Ramirez or someone of similar authority, withdrawing to report the unexpected resistance. Jimmy could have disabled this vehicle easily from his position, but allowed it to depart. A tactical decision, the communication of their failure would create more valuable effects than capturing a mid-level commander. As dawn approached, the cartel force had fully withdrawn from his immediate property, maintaining observation positions at extended range. The first engagement had ended in their retreat, but Jimmy harbored no illusions about the conflict being over. This was merely the first round, a testing of defenses. The response would be more substantial, better planned, executed with the full resources of an organization that controlled vast territories and maintained private armies. Jimmy used the temporary reprieve to resupply his positions, check his defensive preparations, and gather intelligence from the equipment the retreating force had abandoned. Their gear confirmed his assessment: former military, likely Mexican special forces corrupted into cartel service. Their weapons were current generation, their tactical gear professional grade. This wasn't a typical enforcement team, but a specialized unit reserved for high-priority operations. It confirmed the personal nature of Vega's vendetta. Committing these resources to target a single retired operator indicated an obsession beyond rational cartel business. The information also clarified the likely next steps. They would return with heavier weapons, possibly including anti-structure munitions or specialized breaching equipment. Jimmy's phone vibrated with an encrypted message from Thompson. Satellite shows tactical retreat. Estimate 68-hour regrouping period before secondary assault. Extraction team available, 90-minute response time. Confirm requirement. Jimmy considered the offer briefly before sending his response: negative extraction. Situation contained. Monitoring continued activity. The reply came quickly. Confirmation required. You are deliberately maintaining position despite identified threat level. Jimmy smiled grimly as he typed. Affirmative. Home field advantage. There would be no further argument. Thompson understood operators and their decisions, even when those decisions contravened logical safety protocols. Jimmy had chosen his ground and would defend it. Mid-morning brought an unexpected development. Sheriff Beck's cruiser approached slowly along the county road, stopping at Jimmy's gate rather than proceeding onto the property. A wise precaution given the night's events. Jimmy approached cautiously, verifying it was indeed Beck before revealing his position. Quite a night you had, Beck called, remaining beside his vehicle. Border Patrol reported unusual vehicle movement in the sector. Then we got reports of explosions and gunfire from your direction. Situation handled, Jimmy replied. Beck's expression was knowing. I've got 3 deputies total, Jimmy. County resources are limited. Whatever's coming your way, it's beyond local law enforcement capacity. Understood. That said, Beck continued, There's been an unusual number of equipment failures affecting certain vehicles observed crossing the county line. Mechanical problems that might delay whatever business they had planned. Jimmy nodded slightly, understanding the implicit message. The sheriff was using his limited resources to create obstacles for cartel movement without directly engaging forces beyond his capacity. "Appreciate the update," Jimmy said. "Your son called the station this morning. Seemed concerned." "I'll handle it." Beck studied him for a moment, professional assessment mixed with personal concern. "You sure about holding this position, Jimmy?" "No shame in tactical withdrawal. This is my home." The simple statement carried the weight of Jimmy's entire post-military life, the peace he'd found in this land, the connection to community he'd built, the normal existence that had healed wounds from decades of classified violence. Beck nodded once, understanding. "Radio Channel 3 is monitored continuously. Just FYI." After the sheriff departed, Jimmy contacted his son using their established secure protocol. "I'm fine," he said before Michael could speak. "Situation is developing but contained. Dad, we've got intelligence about a major cartel mobilization in your sector. This isn't a standard operation. They've pulled specialists from across the border, heavy weapons, tactical teams. Expected. They found the metals." A pause on the line. "What metals?" "From Sandstorm." Another, longer pause. Despite being his son, Michael had never been briefed on Jimmy's classified operations. The name meant nothing to him, but the implication was clear. This was connected to his father's hidden past. "I can be there in 3 hours," Michael said finally. "Negative. Maintain your position and protocols. This is specifically targeted. Your involvement creates additional vulnerability." The tactical language emerged naturally in moments of stress, the speech patterns of his operational career replacing the more casual communication of his farming years. "Dad, Michael, trust my assessment and training. This isn't my first asymmetric engagement." After ending the call, Jimmy continued preparations for the expected second assault. Intelligence gathered from abandoned equipment suggested they would return with enhanced capabilities, likely including heavy weapons, possibly armored vehicles appropriated from corrupted military or police sources. His defensive options were limited by the need to protect his property from excessive damage. Certain countermeasures were restricted by his determination to maintain his farm as a functional operation after the conflict concluded. It created tactical constraints that required creative solutions. Jimmy's mind flashed to a jungle operation in Panama, 1992. His team tasked with protecting a village from forces with superior firepower. They'd succeeded by manipulating perception, by creating the appearance of defenses more extensive than reality, by psychological operations that exploited the enemy's assumptions and fears. He would apply those same principles now. The cartel would expect him to have established a defensive perimeter, to have concentrated his preparations around protecting the structures. They would plan their assault accordingly, with breaching operations against hardened positions. Instead, Jimmy prepared a defense based on mobility, on allowing certain penetrations while maintaining the ability to strike from unexpected angles. He established multiple fallback positions, each supplied for extended operations, each providing coverage of the likely approach vectors. By mid-afternoon, cartel vehicles had begun reappearing on the distant ridgelines. Observation teams establishing sight lines, assessing potential defensive preparations. Jimmy allowed them to observe certain activities, movements between buildings, efforts to reinforce windows, the appearance of preparing for a siege. The actual defensive preparations remained concealed. Underground passages connecting key structures. Remotely triggered countermeasures designed to separate assault teams from supporting elements. Communication disruption systems that would isolate teams at critical moments. As evening approached, thermal imaging showed increased activity beyond the perimeter. The cartel force had indeed returned with enhanced capabilities. Vehicle signatures consistent with armored transports. Heat signatures suggesting crew-served weapons. Movement patterns indicating at least 3 times the personnel of the previous night's assault. Jimmy settled into his primary position as darkness fell, surrounded by the supplies and equipment for extended operations. Water, ammunition, communication gear, medical supplies. His mind calm, focused on the tactical challenge without emotional distraction. This was familiar territory, despite the years of peaceful farming. The operational mindset returned with disturbing ease, as though the intervening decade of civilian life had been the aberration rather than his decades of classified violence. The attack began differently this time. No stealth approach, no assumption of surprise. Instead, a psychological operation of their own, vehicles with mounted lights illuminating the farmyard, engines roaring, a show of overwhelming force designed to intimidate before the actual assault. Jimmy remained motionless, observing through specialized optics. Their tactical plan became evident in their positioning. A frontal assault on the house, with secondary teams approaching the barn and outbuildings. Vehicle-mounted weapons providing suppressive fire from multiple angles. Standard protocol against a target believed to be a single operator, even one with military training. Overwhelming force, multiple simultaneous breaches, suppressing defensive fire before the target could effectively respond. What they couldn't know was that Jimmy's defensive planning had anticipated precisely this approach. As the vehicles moved into their final positions, they crossed the activation boundaries of his prepared countermeasures. Radio-controlled charges detonated beneath the primary access road, not powerful enough to destroy vehicles but sufficient to disable them, stranding assault teams between their starting positions and their objectives. Simultaneously, Jimmy activated his communication disruption equipment, specialized jammers that blocked the frequencies used by the cartel teams. Their coordinated assault immediately began degrading into isolated unit actions without central command. The cartel forces responded with heavy weapons fire, directing thousands of rounds toward the house and barn. The structures, reinforced during Jimmy's preparations, absorbed the initial barrage while he remained in his concealed position away from the buildings. Through his thermal imaging, Jimmy observed the assault teams beginning their advance despite the disrupted vehicles and communications. Their training was evident in their maintenance of formation despite the complications. These were indeed professionals, adapting to changing tactical situations rather than abandoning the operation. As they crossed the halfway point to the structures, Jimmy triggered his next countermeasure. Directional explosives concealed within ordinary farm equipment detonated, not aimed directly at personnel but positioned to disable their specialized equipment. Night vision systems, communications backups, breaching equipment. The effect was immediate. The advance faltered as team leaders assessed the damage and attempted to reconstruct their assault plan without central coordination. Jimmy used this moment of disruption to begin selective fire from his concealed position, targeting communication equipment, weapon-mounted systems, and occasional carefully placed shots that wounded rather than killed, creating the additional tactical complication of injured personnel requiring assistance. His mind flashed to a classified operation in Myanmar, 2005. Extracting an asset from a facility guarded by forces with superior numbers but inferior training. Using their procedures against them, exploiting the rigid tactical thinking that couldn't adapt to unexpected resistance. The same principles applied now. The cartel teams were trained for overwhelming force against limited resistance. Their procedures didn't account for a defender with comparable tactical knowledge and superior preparation. Every action they took according to their training became a vulnerability Jimmy could exploit. The assault fragmented further as minutes passed. Team leaders, unable to communicate with central command, began making independent decisions. Some continued the advance toward primary structures. Others sought covered positions to assess and reorganize. The disciplined formation deteriorated into localized engagements without coordinated objectives. Jimmy maintained selective pressure, engaging targets of opportunity while constantly changing position. His knowledge of the terrain allowed movement that appeared impossible to the observers. His prepared routes enabled him to engage from one. Dawn revealed the aftermath of the night's engagement. 3 disabled cartel vehicles remained on the property, abandoned by retreating forces. Shell casings littered the ground, evidence of the thousands of rounds expended against positions Jimmy had never occupied. Equipment lay scattered, communication gear, tactical harnesses, specialized tools dropped during hasty withdrawal. Jimmy moved methodically through his property, assessing damage while maintaining vigilance. The main house had absorbed significant fire, windows shattered and walls pockmarked with bullet holes. The barn's eastern wall was partially collapsed from what appeared to be an RPG impact. Fencing was destroyed in multiple sections, allowing his livestock to wander freely across neighboring fields. Despite the property damage, Jimmy's tactical victory had been decisive. The cartel force had withdrawn in disarray, their coordinated assault degraded into individual survival efforts. Intelligence gathered from abandoned equipment confirmed his assessment. They had expected to overwhelm a single operator through conventional tactics. They hadn't prepared for asymmetric resistance executed with professional precision. As he collected useful equipment from the battlefield, Jimmy's satellite phone vibrated with an encrypted message from Thompson. Drone surveillance confirms multiple casualties evacuated from your position. Estimated 40% operational effectiveness reduction of assault force. SIGINT indicates significant command structure disruption. Be advised, Vega personally involved in next operational planning. Extraction option remains available. Jimmy considered the intelligence as he worked. Vega's personal involvement changed the tactical situation. A cartel leader would typically remain insulated from direct operations, protected by layers of subordinates. His willingness to engage directly indicated an escalation beyond standard cartel procedure, a vendetta that overrode operational security considerations. Understood, Jimmy replied to Thompson. Additional intelligence on Vega's probable approach requested. The response came 30 minutes later. Vega background updated. Formal Mexican military training, specialized counterinsurgency operations. Personally commanded operations against rival cartels 2018-2022. Tactical signature indicates preference for overwhelming firepower followed by specialized infiltration teams. Probable next action, standoff engagement to suppress defensive capability, followed by multiple small team insertions. The assessment aligned with Jimmy's observations. The night's assault had been professionally planned, but lacked the specialized approach a counterinsurgency expert would implement. That suggested the previous attacks had been executed by subordinates, while the next would likely reflect Vega's personal tactical philosophy. Mid-morning brought unexpected contact. A pickup truck approached slowly along the county road, stopping at a respectful distance from the property. Through his optics, Jimmy recognized Bill Jackson, his nearest neighbor, 3 miles down the road. Jimmy approached cautiously, maintaining awareness of potential sniper positions on surrounding ridgelines. "Jesus, Jimmy," Bill called, surveying the damaged buildings and vehicles. "Heard the commotion last night. Whole county's talking about it. You okay?" "I'm fine. Sheriff's got roadblocks on all access routes, turning away unauthorized vehicles as he calls them. But he's got 3 deputies total. Can't maintain that perimeter long." Bill hesitated. "Town's organizing, Jimmy. Veterans, ranchers, folks who've watched these cartels moving in across the border. They're gathering at my place. Thought you should know." Jimmy considered this development carefully. Civilian involvement created additional tactical complexity, potential casualties from untrained personnel entering an active combat zone. "Appreciate the information. Tell them to maintain distance. This situation is targeted, specific to my property." Bill studied him with the knowing look of a fellow veteran, though his service had been conventional military rather than special operations. "That barn of yours," he said finally. "Never did believe you were just storing hay in there." He gestured toward the ruined eastern wall. "Found some interesting things when they blew that section open, didn't they?" Jimmy remained silent, neither confirming nor denying. "Well," Bill continued, "whatever's happening, you should know you're not alone out here. Community looks after its own." He returned to his truck, then paused. "By the way, strange weather pattern developing. Meteorologist on the radio saying visibility will be near zero by evening. Unusual fog and possible precipitation. He gave Jimmy a meaningful look. Just so you know. After Bill departed, Jimmy processed the information. The community was mobilizing, creating a defensive perimeter beyond his property, providing environmental intelligence. It was unexpected support, though it complicated his tactical planning. The weather information was particularly relevant. Reduced visibility would hinder the surveillance he'd observed on surrounding ridgelines, potentially allowing movement that would otherwise be detected. It also suggested the local population included individuals with specialized knowledge. Weather patterns were being tracked for tactical applications, indicating veterans with relevant experience. Jimmy used the daylight hours to repair critical infrastructure and prepare for the anticipated next phase. Water systems secured, power generators checked, defensive positions reinforced. Medical supplies inventoried and distributed to treatment stations established throughout the property. As he worked, his mind returned repeatedly to Operation Sandstorm, the classified mission that had initiated Vega's vendetta. The official record portrayed it as a limited covert action targeting cartel logistics. The reality had been more complex, more morally ambiguous. His team had been tasked with eliminating specific cartel leadership without attributable American involvement. The operation had succeeded technically, with primary targets neutralized. But the collateral effects had been significant. Family members present during the operation, local civilians caught in subsequent cartel power struggles. Jimmy had never seen photographs of those affected, had never known names beyond the primary targets. Operational security had required that compartmentalization. But he had carried the weight of those unknown casualties throughout his subsequent career, through his retirement, through his attempt to build a life of peace. Now one of those collateral effects had a name, a face, resources, and a burning desire for revenge. Alejandro Vega, son of a cartel leader eliminated during Sandstorm, had spent years tracing the operators responsible. The other team members already neutralized. Jimmy the last remaining target. By evening, the weather had indeed changed dramatically. A dense fog rolled across the landscape, visibility reduced to less than 50 meters. Temperature dropped sharply, creating a misty precipitation that further complicated surveillance and movement. Jimmy activated his thermal imaging systems, but even these were partially compromised by the environmental conditions. Heat signatures became diffused, distance calculation less precise. The reduced effectiveness of technology meant greater reliance on traditional skills, sound recognition, tactile awareness, intuitive threat assessment. At 2,100 hours, Jimmy detected the first indication of renewed cartel activity. Vehicle movement along the southern approach, engines muffled but still audible in the dense fog. Not the full tactical force of previous engagements, but smaller, more mobile units. Vega was implementing the anticipated change in tactics, specialized teams rather than overwhelming force. The fog and precipitation provided cover for approach, but also created navigation challenges for the cartel teams. Jimmy used his superior knowledge of the terrain to maintain positional advantage, observing their movement while remaining undetected. Through thermal imaging, he identified 3 separate teams approaching from different vectors. Small units, 3 to 4 operators each, moving with the disciplined spacing of Special Operations Forces. Their equipment was minimal, designed for infiltration rather than sustained engagement. This was a hunter-killer operation, targeting a specific individual rather than attempting to secure territory. Jimmy settled into a concealed observation position, allowing the teams to penetrate his outer perimeter. Their movement patterns confirmed his assessment. These were highly trained operators executing a specialized mission profile. Their discipline was evident in their silent communication, their precise navigation through difficult conditions, their maintenance of formation despite the near-zero visibility. As they approached his primary structures, they moved with increased caution, expecting countermeasures similar to previous engagements. Jimmy allowed them to conduct preliminary reconnaissance, to identify the damage from earlier battles, to begin forming conclusions about his likely positions and capabilities. The first team entered the damaged barn, moving systematically through the structure. The second maintained surveillance on the house, establishing firing positions that covered potential exit routes. The third circled toward the equipment shed, likely designated as a command post for the operation. Jimmy remained motionless, observing their deployment. These operators represented a significantly higher threat level than previous forces. Their tactical approach showed professional assessment of the situation, adaptation to known countermeasures, specialized infiltration techniques. This was Vega's personal operational signature: precise, patient, methodical elimination of resistance. As the teams completed their initial deployment, a new vehicle approached along the main access road. Unlike the tactical units, this one moved directly and openly, headlights illuminating the fog, creating an obvious target. A deliberate tactic, a high-value asset protected by deployed teams, confident in their established perimeter. Through his optics, Jimmy observed Alejandro Vega himself exit the vehicle. Mid-30s, military bearing, surrounded by personal security with specialized weapons. His presence confirmed the personal nature of the vendetta, a cartel leader exposing himself to potential danger to witness the operation directly. Vega surveyed the damaged buildings, his expression visible even through the fog: cold satisfaction at the destruction, controlled anticipation of completing his mission. He spoke quietly to his security team, likely receiving updates on the infiltration progress. Jimmy assessed his options with tactical clarity. The deployed teams created a complex engagement challenge, each positioned to support the others, communications likely encrypted and jamming resistant based on equipment visible. Direct confrontation would trigger a coordinated response with high probability of effective suppressive fire. Instead, he implemented an approach developed during classified operations in environments with similar challenges. Rather than engaging the tactically superior force directly, he would manipulate their operational rhythm, create uncertainty that degraded their coordination. Jimmy activated a series of pre-positioned devices throughout the property. Not explosives or direct countermeasures, but specialized equipment that created subtle environmental manipulations: directional sound projectors, thermal disruption systems, localized electromagnetic interference. The effects were immediate but difficult for the cartel teams to interpret. Communication systems experiencing intermittent failure, thermal signatures appearing and disappearing at irregular intervals. Directional sound creating the impression of movement in multiple locations simultaneously. Through his optics, Jimmy observed the impact on their operational cohesion. Team leaders attempting to maintain tactical discipline while processing confusing environmental data. Security personnel surrounding Vega becoming increasingly alert, weapons raised, scanning for threats they could sense but not locate. Vega himself showed the first signs of uncertainty, moving closer to his vehicle, issuing commands with increased urgency. The controlled confidence previously evident in his bearing began deteriorating as the psychological pressure increased. Jimmy used this moment of tactical disruption to change position, moving silently through prepared routes to a secondary observation post with different firing angles. The fog and specialized equipment concealed his movement, allowing him to establish new tactical advantage without detection. The cartel teams attempted to adjust to the degrading situation, implementing countermeasures against an enemy they couldn't locate. Thermal sweeps, communication channel changes, altered defensive positions. Professional responses, but increasingly reactive rather than proactive as their tactical initiative eroded. Jimmy continued the psychological operation, activating different systems and unpredictable patterns. The dense fog amplified the effects, transforming the battlefield into an environment that defied reliable sensory input. Even highly trained operators became susceptible to uncertainty when fundamental situational awareness was compromised. As the cartel teams struggled to maintain operational cohesion, Jimmy detected a critical vulnerability developing. The security team around Vega was becoming increasingly isolated from the infiltration teams, their attention focused outward, scanning for threats rather than maintaining coordination with deployed units. It was the opening he had methodically created, the tactical opportunity that asymmetric warfare required. With disciplined precision, Jimmy began executing a specialized approach developed during counterinsurgency operations, systematic isolation of command elements from operational units. He activated targeted communication disruption affecting only the frequencies used by Vega's security team, creating a localized dead zone that separated them from the infiltration units. Simultaneously, he triggered environmental effects that suggested threat movement in the opposite direction from his actual position, drawing their attention and defensive focus away from his approach vector. Through years of operating on his property, Jimmy had developed an ability to move across the terrain without visual references, navigating by feel and memory alone. The fog that blinded others simply concealed his movement as he approached Vega's position with the silent efficiency that had once made him legendary within the classified operational community. Vega's security team maintained professional discipline despite the degrading situation, establishing a protective perimeter around their principal. But their formation was designed to counter conventional threats, visible attackers approaching from identifiable vectors. Their training hadn't prepared them for an operator who moved like a ghost through terrain he knew intimately, who could navigate by touch and sound in conditions that rendered visual acquisition nearly impossible. Jimmy penetrated their perimeter without detection, positioning himself within effective range of Vega while maintaining concealment. The cartel leader remained near his vehicle, increasingly agitated as reports from his teams contained more questions than information. The controlled commander had been replaced by a man facing the disintegration of his carefully planned operation. As Vega issued orders into his communication device, receiving static and fragmented responses, Jimmy made his decision. Not elimination, though the shot was available. The cycle of violence that had brought Vega to his farm had claimed enough lives, created enough collateral damage. Instead, Jimmy executed a specialized non-lethal approach. A carefully placed shot that disabled Vega's communication equipment without injury, followed by systematic neutralization of surrounding security team equipment, weapons optics, tactical radios, specialized gear. Not attacking personnel directly, but eliminating their technological advantages, reducing professional operators to disoriented individuals in a hostile environment they couldn't effectively navigate. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The security team's coordinated defense transformed into individual survival responses, their training insufficient to maintain cohesion when fundamental tools were systematically eliminated. Vega himself was suddenly exposed, his protective layer disintegrating around him. Jimmy moved with practiced silence through the confusion he'd created, approaching Vega directly. The cartel leader sensed movement too late, turning to find himself facing the man he'd hunted across hundreds of miles, committed significant resources to eliminate. "You know who I am," Jimmy said quietly, his voice barely audible above the confusion surrounding them. Vega's expression shifted from surprise to hatred. "Sandstorm, you killed my father." Operation Sandstorm targeted cartel leadership engaged in specific activities. "Your father was a primary target due to verified intelligence about his operations. I was following orders." "You destroyed my family," Vega responded, his controlled exterior cracking to reveal raw emotion beneath. "My mother was there. My sister. Collateral damage, your government called it." Jimmy absorbed this information with a physical impact he didn't reveal. The compartmentalized nature of the operation meant he'd never received full details about secondary casualties. The cartel leader's family, present during the operation, eliminated alongside primary targets. "I didn't know," Jimmy said finally. The simple truth, inadequate against the weight of Vega's loss, but the only response possible. "And yet you continued." Operation after operation. How many other families became collateral damage while you followed orders? Vega's voice carried the accumulated bitterness of years spent pursuing vengeance. Too many, Jimmy acknowledged. Why I left. Why I came here. To build something rather than destroy. Around them, the tactical situation continued deteriorating for the cartel forces. The infiltration teams, separated from command and encountering environmental manipulation beyond their training, had begun a disorganized withdrawal. The security team, their equipment systematically disabled, maintained protective positions around Vega but without effective coordination or situational awareness. You think this ends here? Vega asked, gesturing toward the chaos surrounding them. I have resources beyond what you've seen. This is merely the first phase. Escalation benefits neither of us, Jimmy replied. Your men need medical attention. Your operation is compromised. Local authorities are aware and responding. This path leads only to additional casualties. For a moment, the tactical situation hung in balance. Jimmy maintained his position, weapon lowered but available. Vega calculating options, weighing personal vendetta against operational reality. Your father made similar calculations, Jimmy continued, his voice steady. Operational decisions based on resource allocation and probability of success. Professional assessment rather than emotional response. The comparison struck home. Vega's expression shifted, the tactician temporarily overriding the vengeful son. He studied Jimmy with cold assessment, recognizing the tactical reality, his force compromised, his position exposed, his options limited. This isn't finished, he said finally. It can be, Jimmy countered. Withdraw your forces. Return to your territory. Accept that some operations aren't viable, regardless of resources committed. The sound of approaching vehicles penetrated the fog, local law enforcement responding to the disturbance. Vega glanced toward the sound, then back at Jimmy, decision crystallizing in his expression. My men withdraw unhindered. All casualties evacuated. No pursuit. Jimmy nodded once. Agreed. The tactical agreement formed between them transcended the personal vendetta, two professionals recognizing when an operation had reached terminal failure, when withdrawal represented the only viable option. Vega issued commands to his remaining security team, instructions for coordinated withdrawal, evacuation priorities, extraction routes. The controlled commander had returned, emotional response subsumed beneath operational necessity. Jimmy maintained his position as the cartel forces executed their withdrawal, ensuring adherence to the tactical agreement. Injured personnel evacuated first, followed by infiltration teams, security elements withdrawing last in professional order. Throughout the extraction, Vega remained beside his vehicle, gaze fixed on Jimmy with an intensity that communicated the incomplete nature of their confrontation. The tactical withdrawal didn't represent resolution but postponement, a professional pause and a personal vendetta. As the last cartel vehicle disappeared into the fog, Vega addressed Jimmy directly. My father taught me that professionals recognize when tactical withdrawal is necessary. He also taught me that strategic objectives remain even when specific operations fail. Jimmy met his gaze evenly. My father taught me to repair what others break. To build rather than destroy. The contrast between their inherited philosophies hung between them, the fundamental conflict that no tactical agreement could resolve. We will meet again, Vega said finally, entering his vehicle. Not on this territory, Jimmy responded, his tone making the statement a promise rather than a threat. As Vega's vehicle disappeared into the fog, Jimmy felt the operational mindset that had sustained him through the engagement begin to recede. The farmer he'd become gradually remerging as the tactical operator subsumed beneath civilian identity. Sheriff Beck's cruiser approached cautiously along the access road, followed by additional vehicles, local law enforcement responding to reports of gunfire, community members concerned about their neighbor. The immediate tactical situation was concluding, transitioning into the aftermath phase that would require different skills, different responses. Jimmy lowered his weapon, exhaling slowly as he prepared to navigate this transition. The revelation of Vega's personal motivation had added complexity to an already difficult situation. The knowledge of additional casualties during Sandstorm, families impacted beyond the operational targets, created a weight he would carry alongside existing burdens. But the immediate threat had been neutralized. His property, though damaged, remained his. The community had rallied rather than abandoned him. The life he'd built hadn't been destroyed by the resurgence of his past. As Sheriff Beck exited his vehicle, surveying the battlefield with professional assessment, Jimmy began the mental shift from operator to civilian, from tactical engagement to community member. The process was familiar after years of practice, though it had never been tested under such extreme circumstances. "Quite a situation you've managed here," Beck observed, his tone balanced between official inquiry and personal concern. "Care to explain exactly what happened on my county roads tonight?" Jimmy considered his response carefully, balancing operational security against the sheriff's legitimate authority. "Old business," he said finally. "Now concluded." Beck studied the property, noting disabled vehicles, evidence of sophisticated tactics, equipment beyond standard criminal organizations. "Concluded for now," he amended. "But we both know how these things work. They rarely end cleanly." Jimmy nodded once, acknowledging the reality. The tactical engagement had been resolved, but the underlying conflict remained. Vega would rebuild his forces, reassess his approach, potentially return with different tactics, different resources. "Communities talking," Beck continued. "Veterans organizing watches, ranchers securing properties. People know something significant happened here tonight." The implications were clear. The isolated engagement on Jimmy's farm had catalyzed broader awareness, community mobilization against cartel expansion. His individual stand had transformed into something larger, more consequential. "Never intended that," Jimmy said quietly. "Rarely do," Beck replied. "But intentions don't always determine outcomes. Sometimes standing your ground has wider effects than expected." As dawn approached, dissipating the fog that had concealed the night's operations, Jimmy surveyed his damaged property with mixed emotions. The structures could be repaired, fences rebuilt, normal operations restored with time and effort. But the peace he'd found in farming, the quiet existence he'd constructed after decades of violence, had been fundamentally altered. Sheriff Beck coordinated the local response, establishing security perimeters, documenting evidence, organizing community resources to assist with immediate repairs. Jimmy provided necessary information while maintaining operational security regarding classified aspects of the situation. Throughout the process, his satellite phone remained silent. Thompson and his agency connections monitoring but not intervening, respecting Jimmy's decision to handle the situation independently. The institutional awareness of what had transpired would remain compartmentalized, denied in official channels, unacknowledged in public records. As the first rays of sunlight penetrated the dissipating fog, Jimmy allowed himself a moment of reflection. The tactical engagement had forced him to reconnect with the operator he'd been, to utilize skills and mindsets he'd deliberately set aside. The transition back to civilian identity would require time, conscious effort, deliberate recommitment to the life he'd chosen. But that life remained viable, despite Vega's attack, despite the resurgence of his past. The farm still stood. The community had rallied rather than retreated. The peace he'd found hadn't been destroyed, merely challenged and tested under extreme circumstances. Sheriff Beck approached as the documentation process concluded, official duties completed, but personal questions remaining. "You know," he said quietly, "in all the years you've lived here, this is the first time I've seen what you're truly capable of." Suspected, but never confirmed until now. Jimmy met his gaze evenly, neither confirming nor denying the assessment. "Community needs to know if this is truly concluded," Beck continued. "If people should prepare for additional incidents." "The immediate threat is neutralized," Jimmy replied carefully. "Whether it remains that way depends on professional assessment overriding personal vendetta." "I believe it will." Beck nodded, accepting the assessment from someone he now recognized possessed expertise beyond civilian experience. In the meantime, he added, might be good to know we've got someone with your particular skill set in the community, given current border situations. The implication was clear. Jimmy's capabilities, now revealed, represented a potential asset beyond his individual property. His stand against the cartel had transformed him from isolated farmer to recognized defender, someone the community might turn to for leadership in future challenges. It wasn't a role he'd sought or desired, but one thrust upon him by circumstances beyond his control. The question remained whether he would accept it, whether the operation forced upon him would catalyze broader involvement or remain an isolated incident as he returned to his chosen civilian life. The week following the confrontation brought a steady stream of visitors to Jimmy's farm. Neighbors arriving with building materials, tools, offers of assistance. Veterans from Esperanza and surrounding communities, some he knew casually from town, others he'd never met, appearing with skilled labor and knowing expressions. Local families bringing food, supplies, quiet support without intrusive questions. Jimmy accepted their help with the same reserved gratitude that had characterized his years in the community. But something had fundamentally changed in the dynamic. A recognition on both sides that the quiet farmer was something more, something different than they had assumed. Bill Jackson coordinated much of the community response, organizing work crews, prioritizing repairs, managing the flow of assistance without overwhelming Jimmy's preference for solitude. As they replaced damaged siding on the barn's eastern wall, he addressed what everyone was thinking but few had directly mentioned. Town's talking, he said casually, measuring a section of lumber. About who you really are. Jimmy continued working, neither encouraging nor discouraging the conversation. Vietnam vets figured it out years ago, Bill continued. The way you move, assess situations, maintain awareness. Younger veterans notice different things, your tactical thinking, resource management, the precision in everything you do. He paused, hammering a nail with practiced efficiency. Nobody's asking for details, but they're piecing things together now that they've seen what happened here. Just defended my home, Jimmy replied, the deliberate simplification both true and grossly inadequate. Bill nodded, respecting the boundaries even as he acknowledged them. That barn, though. He gestured toward the damaged structure they were repairing. Heard they found some interesting things when that wall came down. Things that told them exactly who they were dealing with. The metals. The physical evidence of a career spent in classified operations, service that could never be publicly acknowledged or celebrated. The discovery that had transformed a routine territorial expansion into a personal vendetta. Communities changing too, Bill added after Jimmy's continued silence. Borders getting complicated. Cartel influence spreading northward. People feeling like authorities are overwhelmed, like they need to take more responsibility for their own security. The implication hung between them. Jimmy's stand against the cartel had catalyzed something larger than an individual defense, sparked community recognition of broader threats and the need for organized response. Never intended to start anything, Jimmy said finally. Most important things aren't planned, Bill replied. They happen when someone stands their ground when they shouldn't be able to. When someone says not here and makes it stick. Later that afternoon, Sheriff Beck arrived with official documentation, incident reports, property damage assessments, the formal paperwork that transformed an extraordinary tactical engagement into a routine law enforcement matter for public records. Border Patrol's increased presence in the sector, he noted as Jimmy reviewed the documents. Federal agencies suddenly very interested in cartel movement patterns across the county. Strings being pulled somewhere above my pay grade. Jimmy nodded slightly, recognizing Thompson's invisible hand at work. The classified elements would remain unacknowledged, but resources were being redirected, attention focused on securing the region without revealing the catalyzing incident. Your son's been calling the station, Beck added. Seems concerned about your situation. He's coming tomorrow, Jimmy replied. The conversation with Michael had been brief but significant. His son's insistence on seeing him, assessing the situation personally, connecting in a way their relationship had rarely allowed. As promised, Michael arrived early the following morning, his Border Patrol vehicle kicking up dust along the access road. His expression as he surveyed the damaged property revealed complicated emotions. Professional assessment mixed with personal concern, the agent and the son simultaneously processing what had occurred. "Dad," he said simply as Jimmy met him on the porch. "You said it was contained." "It is." Michael gestured toward the bullet-riddled structures, the evidence of heavy weapons fire, the tactical scars visible throughout the property. "This isn't what contained usually looks like." They moved inside, where Jimmy had prepared coffee with the same methodical precision that characterized all his actions. For several minutes they sat in silence, the weight of unspoken history between them. "Those men," Michael said finally, "they weren't typical cartel soldiers. Sheriff Beck showed me the equipment they abandoned. Special operations grade. Former military." Jimmy nodded once, neither confirming nor denying. "And yet you held them off. Alone." Michael studied his father with new awareness, pieces of a puzzle he'd recognized but never fully assembled falling into place. "Your military service. It wasn't what you told us, was it?" The question penetrated layers of operational security, family history, the careful compartmentalization Jimmy had maintained throughout his son's life. The barrier between his classified career and his family role had remained intact for decades, protected by habits of secrecy ingrained through years of specialized service. But the events on his farm had shattered those barriers. His past and present had collided with irrevocable force, revealing truths he could no longer conceal from those closest to him. "No," he acknowledged finally. "It wasn't." The simple admission opened a door that had remained locked throughout their relationship. Michael didn't press for classified details, understanding both official restrictions and his father's deeply ingrained habits of secrecy. Instead, he focused on what the revelation meant for their shared history, the context it provided for his father's distant periods, the explanation for behaviors he'd never fully understood. "All those years," Michael said quietly. "The deployments we couldn't talk about. The skills you never explained having. The nightmares Mom never mentioned, but we all knew about." Jimmy met his son's gaze directly, acknowledging the impact his career had imposed on his family. "Made choices. Tried to keep it separate. Protect you from it. And now?" The question contained multitudes. Was the threat truly eliminated? Had Jimmy's past been fully exposed? Would the careful life he constructed continue or transform into something else? "Now we rebuild," Jimmy replied simply. "Continue." As afternoon approached, more visitors arrived, a delegation of local veterans led by former Marines who'd recognized in Jimmy's tactical achievement something that transcended ordinary combat experience. They came not with offers of physical assistance, which other community members had already provided, but with formal recognition of what he represented. "Communities organizing," explained Frank Delgado, a former recon Marine who'd served multiple tours in Afghanistan. "Neighborhood watches, security patrols, training for property owners. Nothing vigilante, all coordinated with Sheriff Beck, all within legal boundaries. But organized, methodical, professional." Jimmy listened without commitment, understanding both the necessity and the potential complications of civilian security initiatives in border regions. "We need advisors," Delgado continued. "People with relevant experience. People who understand threat assessment, resource allocation, coordination with official agencies." The request remained unspoken but clear. Jimmy's expertise, suddenly revealed to the community, represented a valuable resource in developing effective security responses to increasing cartel activity. "Just a farmer," Jimmy replied, the response automatic after years of careful identity maintenance. Delgado smiled slightly. "Sure, and I just grow tomatoes in my garden. But some of us have done other things, learned skills that might help keep this community safe." After the delegation departed, Jimmy walked his property alone, assessing repairs, calculating priorities, establishing normalcy through methodical planning. The physical damage could be addressed through straightforward effort. The more complex transformation was internal. His carefully constructed civilian identity irrevocably altered, his role in the community shifting from isolated farmer to recognized protector. At sunset, he found himself at the barn, where repairs had temporarily stalled as materials were gathered for major structural work. The eastern wall remained partially open, revealing the hidden compartment that had contained his metals, the physical evidence of his classified service that had triggered Vega's vendetta. Jimmy knelt beside the compartment, examining the splintered wood, the exposed cavity that had once contained his most carefully guarded secrets. The metals themselves had been relocated to a more secure position, but their discovery had initiated the cascade of events that transformed his quiet existence. From the compartment, he retrieved a photograph he'd kept secured alongside the metals, his original operational team from the earliest classified missions. Young faces, serious expressions, men with whom he'd shared experiences that could never be publicly discussed. 3 now confirmed dead, hunted by Vega's forces before they reached Jimmy. The others scattered across the country, some still in government service, others attempting civilian transitions similar to his own. As darkness fell, Jimmy made a decision. Not dramatic or sudden, but the crystallization of thoughts that had been forming since the confrontation with Vega. His attempt to completely separate his past from his present had failed. The skills and experiences that had defined his classified career remained part of him, resources that could be selectively utilized without fully abandoning the peaceful existence he'd constructed. The following morning, he contacted Sheriff Beck. "Community Security Initiative," he said without preamble when Beck answered. "What's the current structure?" Beck's momentary silence suggested surprise at Jimmy's proactive engagement, followed by understanding of its significance. "Informal. Veterans organizing by region, establishing communication networks, coordinating with my limited official resources. Could use some standardization, some professional guidance. Might be able to help with that." The understated offer represented a fundamental shift in Jimmy's relationship with the community, from deliberately isolated individual to engaged advisor, from anonymous farmer to recognized security asset. "Would be appreciated," Beck replied with similar understatement. "Town meeting tomorrow evening at the community center. If you happen to attend, people would listen to whatever insights you might share." After ending the call, Jimmy felt a weight lift that he hadn't fully acknowledged carrying. The constant vigilance required to maintain his compartmentalized identity, to separate the farmer from the operator, had created a subtle but persistent burden. The integration of these aspects offered a different kind of peace, not the complete separation he'd initially sought, but a balanced utilization of all parts of himself. When Michael returned that evening, he found his father working methodically on property repairs, the disciplined efficiency that had always characterized his actions now openly revealing its military origins. They worked together in comfortable silence, the barriers between them not eliminated but significantly reduced. "Mom would have been pleased," Michael said as they completed a section of fence line. "She always said someday you'd find a way to use what you knew to help people directly, not just through operations nobody could acknowledge." Jimmy paused, memories of his late wife surfacing with unusual clarity. She had understood his classified service better than anyone, had supported his transition to farming with patient recognition of his need to build rather than destroy, had encouraged his connection to community even as he maintained operational distance. She was right about most things, he acknowledged quietly. As darkness approached, Jimmy surveyed his property with renewed perspective. The tactical scars would heal with time and effort. The buildings would be repaired, fences restored, normal agricultural operations resumed. But the transformation initiated by Vega's attack had permanently altered something more fundamental than physical structures. The carefully maintained boundary between his past and present had dissolved, replaced by a more integrated identity that acknowledged both the farmer and the operator, the individual and the community member, the peaceful civilian and the capable defender. The metals that had triggered Vega's vendetta would remain secured, but no longer completely hidden. Their discovery had forced a reconciliation Jimmy had unconsciously needed but deliberately avoided. Acceptance of his complete identity rather than compartmentalized fragments. In the distance, he could see vehicles approaching along the county road. More community members bringing supplies, offering assistance, connecting with the neighbor they had known for years but only recently begun to truly understand. Their support represented not just practical help but acceptance of who he was, appreciation for what he had done. Jimmy watched their approach with cautious optimism. The peace he had sought in farming hadn't been destroyed by the resurgence of his past, merely transformed into something more complex but potentially more sustainable. Not the complete separation of identities he had initially pursued, but an integration that acknowledged both the skills developed through classified service and the connections established through community engagement. Vega remained a potential threat, his tactical withdrawal not necessarily indicating abandoned vendetta. But the immediate danger had been neutralized, the community alerted, resources mobilized. Whatever came next would face not an isolated individual but an organized response with professional guidance. As the first vehicle pulled into his drive, Jimmy stepped forward to greet his neighbors, no longer the anonymous farmer but the recognized defender, the acknowledged protector. The man whose stand against overwhelming force had inspired a community to recognize its own capacity for resilience. The transformation was complete, not from farmer to operator, but from isolated individual to integrated community member who utilized all aspects of his experience to protect what he valued. The life he had built remained his foundation, but now incorporated rather than denied the capabilities that had defined his classified career. In that integration, Jimmy found an unexpected peace, not the complete separation from violence he had initially sought, but a balanced application of all he had learned through decades of service, both classified and civilian. The medals in their secure location represented not just past achievements but ongoing commitment, not just individual service but community protection. The transformation had been neither planned nor sought, but now that it had occurred, Jimmy recognized its necessity, its inevitability, its potential for creating something more valuable than what had existed before. Not just a farm restored after attack, but a community strengthened against future threats. Not just a retired operator finding peace, but a defender utilizing specialized skills for direct protection rather than abstract national security. As neighbors gathered on his property, Jimmy stepped into this transformed identity with the same quiet dignity that had characterized his previous transitions. The details of his classified service would remain protected, the operational specifics unshared, the compartmentalization maintained where necessary. But the capabilities those experiences had developed would now serve a visible, acknowledged purpose within the community that had accepted him as one of their own. 3 months after the confrontation, Jimmy's farm had been largely restored. New siding covered the barn's eastern wall, bullet holes patched in the farmhouse, fences rebuilt across his property. Only subtle differences revealed what had occurred: reinforced windows installed during repairs, improved sightlines cleared around structures, security systems integrated into the agricultural equipment. The changes extended beyond his immediate property. Throughout Esperanza, community security had transformed from informal concern to organized initiative. Veterans conducting regular patrols along county roads. Farmers establishing communication networks to report suspicious activity. Sheriff Beck coordinating local efforts with increased Border Patrol presence. The unofficial alliance effectively extending limited official resources. Jimmy's role remained characteristically understated. He attended planning meetings, offered tactical assessments, trained volunteer groups in basic security protocols. His contributions acknowledged but never celebrated. His expertise respected without intrusive questions about its origins. Intelligence from Thompson indicated the tactical impact extended further still. Cartel activity had decreased significantly across the sector, operations diverted to less resistant territory. Vega had withdrawn to traditional strongholds, his personal vendetta apparently suspended, if not abandoned. The decisive defense of one property had disrupted expansion plans across multiple counties. On a cool autumn evening, Jimmy sat on his porch watching sunset colors paint the distant ridgelines where cartel observers had once maintained surveillance positions. Michael's Border Patrol vehicle approached along the access road, a regular occurrence now as father and son established a relationship with fewer barriers between them. "Quiet sector today," Michael reported as they shared coffee on the porch. "No unusual movement across the entire county." Jimmy nodded, accepting the information without comment. They both understood the temporary nature of such assessments, the persistent reality of border dynamics, the ongoing need for vigilance. "Community meeting was productive," Michael continued. "Coordination protocols established with federal agencies. Information sharing without operational interference. Beck has a good system developing." The cartel's defeat was undeniable, the immediate threat neutralized through tactical expertise, community response, and coordinated official action. Though some questioned the extent of Jimmy's actions, most celebrated the powerful message sent: America does not bow to intimidation. Jimmy, humble yet firm, quietly stepped back from the limelight, continuing duties without fanfare, steadfast in moral clarity. His story stands as a testament to an enduring American truth, that genuine strength lies not in aggression but in preparedness, resolve, and the unwavering commitment to justice and liberty for all. What do you think about this incredible stand? Do you believe strength alone guarantees justice, or does real power lie in partnership, strategy, and bravery? Share your perspective in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe for more gripping real-life stories of courage in the face of overwhelming odds. Around the community, Jimmy remained simply the farmer, the modest description now carrying layers of meaning beyond agricultural occupation. The metals discovered in his barn had been returned to their secure location, physical reminders of classified service that had shaped his capabilities but not defined his identity. The quiet vigilance that had once marked him as unusual now recognized as the foundation of community security. Each morning, Jimmy continued his established routines: coffee at dawn, property inspection, agricultural operations managed with characteristic precision. But integrated within these patterns were new elements: security assessments shared with neighboring farms, training sessions for veterans groups, coordination with official agencies through carefully established protocols. The peaceful existence he had sought in farming remained his foundation, but now incorporated rather than excluded the capabilities developed through classified service. Not a return to operations, but a selective application of specialized skills for direct community protection. Not isolated independence, but integrated security contributing to broader resilience. In this balance, Jimmy found a more sustainable peace than his initial attempt at complete separation. The operator and the farmer, the individual and the community member, the classified specialist and the public defender, aspects no longer compartmentalized but integrated into a coherent whole. As darkness settled over his restored property, Jimmy recognized that the transformation forced upon him by Vega's attack had ultimately created something stronger than what existed before. Not just structures rebuilt after damage, but community bonds reinforced through shared response to threat. Not just individual defense of isolated territory, but collective security established through coordinated action. The metals that had triggered the confrontation now represented not just past service, but ongoing commitment. Not just classified operations, but community protection. Their discovery had initiated conflict, but ultimately catalyzed resolution. Integration rather than separation, acknowledgement rather than denial, strength through connection rather than isolation.